And
We are live.
all right.
Okay.
Please rise and join me in the pledge of allegiance, even if you're home watching. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible.
Liberty and justice from.
Zoom lag. Yeah. So first up, we have the discussion of the Ardsley train station. Chet, did you want to come join us?
Yes.
I guess you can have that empty seat right there. Perfect.
Is this microphone supposed to speak to the speakers?
I don't know. I don't know if it really matters. I can share mine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think they just kind of pick it up anyway. So
They all work the same.
That's right, yeah.
it's my 10-second version of why we're here with Chet tonight is what was the issue? It was 2015 when we first signed the lease was signed, or
Yes,
2016?
it was 2015 when the lease for this.
So
station was
in
up.
2015, we had passed I guess we included the Ardsley train station in the railroad district, had approved uses for that particular station. And the leasing was proposed by the MTA with the caveats. That's not really a big caveat. It was explicitly stated that he had to repair. It wasn't even just maintained. So it was really repairs were needed. And in turn for a 200-year lease, it was that for $50,000, he was expected to make some fairly major, some of it's structural. It's not just appearance wise. It wasn't a coat of paint. And none of that's actually happened. And here we are in 8 years into a 200-year lease. Time's ticking. And the MTA now would like to basically give him the building permanently for no additional compensation. They reached out to us basically to let us know. I wrote immediately that I thought it was a mistake, and I pointed out that he is not, in fact, because he basically, I think he told the MTA that he's been doing everything he can to repair the building, but the Village of Irvington's been standing in his way because we haven't been issuing permits for him. Meanwhile, he'll basically say, hey, I'm going to fix the roof. Here's a picture of a roof. Here's my, can you give me a permit? And obviously, that's not the way it works. So my understanding is he doesn't have any permits for the major work, and he's never responded to the building department asking him for more information about the project so they could issue the permits so we can get the work done. I should also say that the village is interested in getting the building renovated, updated, and continue to have it maintained. We think it's an important building. It's obviously a historic building. It's unfortunate that we lost the bridge that went over because that was another historic piece of it. But that's, the MTA did not want to have that rebuilt by anybody, even someone else paid for it. So I think that's why we're here, trying to figure out, is there something for the village to do, even though the MTA very well knows where we stood on their plan, which they also know where the Friends of the Ardsley train station stands, which is a group, and Chet, I'll let you explain what that group is, who it's comprised of. But it's basically the most adjacent stakeholders to the train station. But I don't know if you want to expand on my background.
No, I think that kind of sets, yeah, go ahead.
One question. Brian has stated that it's a historic building. At what level of historic designation was this building?
So the building is eligible to be added to both the national and the state list of historic places, but it has not in fact been added. So it is eligible. And one of the things we'll talk about is requirement under the lease that MTA had that the tenant had to do whatever he could to make sure it continued to be eligible and not do any alterations otherwise. But it is not protected right now. And that's part of the big problem here. So Brian, I think, first off, thank you very much for giving me the time to speak tonight. I really appreciate it. And thank you. And I tried to set out somewhat of a lengthy letter. I apologize, to kind of set the scene and put it in context. And actually, there's a couple things I just want to add that have happened since I sent my letter that I think are important for you to know, that I think will help our discussion. So I sent out the letter on August 8th. On August 10th, I finally was able to reach David Florio at the MTA and spoke to him and asked him, what is the status of things? And what he told me was things are progressing very quickly. as he said, the lease, the language of the deed is being negotiated. And he wouldn't tell me anything more than that. I asked him whether or not the language that we had requested that I put in the letter to you guys has been included. I think he wasn't quite sure. He's not the lawyer doing all this stuff. So he couldn't say, all he could say was the lease, the deed is being negotiated. I asked him whether or not I again emphasized to him the importance of adding that language for reasons that I can explain. I asked him whether the MTA or the tenant was going to subdivide the property before they actually transferred the property. And he told me that they have spoken to, I think, the town, and the town says that's not necessary, that they can transfer the parcel, which is just the building, but it'll then be up to the tenant or the new owner to then seek a subdivision. I haven't checked to know if that's accurate or not, but that's what he told me they're going to do. He also said to me that he expects that whatever the language that's being negotiated will be finalized shortly after Labor Day and will be ready to be signed. So the timing of this is acute. The other thing I wanted to mention to you is that I have spoken at length to Susan Tolchin in Senator Stuart Cousins' office. I've spoken at length to David Moore at the county and with Mary Jane Shimsky, our assembly member, and have outlined for them where we stand and my request to the MTA that they include this language and the fact that I was meeting with you. I think they're very up to speed, but they want to know what the village's position is going to be before they kind of step in. So again, the timing of this is somewhat acute. So what, again, I'm not gonna go through the story. I can answer any questions you guys have, but what brings us here is you're right, Brian, the MTA has decided to kind of wash its hands of this building and transfer it to the tenant, which is a company called Ardsley Train Station, which is owned by a guy named John Michael DeGennaro, who is a contractor in Yonkers. And while the MTA has said that they've always intended that this building really be under the supervision of the village, and it all be restored and let the village really manage that stuff, that is what's led. And even though I have pressed them not to do this, they're going to do it. And therefore, what I've said to him is that if you're going to turn to the village and expect the village to do that, you've got to give the village the tools to do that. And that is why I have specifically asked them, and I'm asking you to ask them to put this language in the deed transfer. And the three things that I'm asking is to put a restricted covenant in about that they have to only do any changes to the building that would not undermine its ability to be added to the National Register. 2, that any changes they make to the exterior of the building be done consistent with the state SHPA office's guidelines for historic buildings and the federal Secretary of Interior guidelines for historic buildings. That they make that restrictive covenant run with the land. And what that means is that it will apply to all successive owners. And that they expressly put in there that it be enforced by the village, that it can be enforced by the village. If they don't do that, if that language is not in the deed and they just transfer it, the village, I will argue till the cows come home that the village can do a lot of things, but the village's position will be much stronger if that language is in the deed. And I'll let Mary Ann comment on that, but that would be the case. Under the lease, it was always contemplated that they might do that, and the supposed quitclaim deed that the lease provides they would use has some of this language in there, and therefore I suspect they may put some of it in there, specifically the restricted covenant portions. But what's really crucial is that they also put in that it runs with the land and that it can be enforced by the village, not just by the MTA. And the reason why, if they don't put in language that it runs with the land, the new owner will just transfer to a new corporation and say, sorry, that doesn't apply. And again, we can argue about whether that's going to be true or not, but that could happen. And if they don't put in expressive language that it can be enforced by the village, an argument could be made that the village can't enforce that. I would argue, of course, against that, but the position for the village would be much stronger. And that's not going to require the village to actually do anything. unless it chooses to do so. But it'll put the village in a position where it can do something. And what I think, and I don't know whether anybody's had an opportunity to go look at the building recently, but it is frankly not in very good shape. It has deteriorated substantially. The tenant was responsible for maintaining and preserving the building. Ryan said actually renovating the building, has done none of that. The building and the results of that is there's a lot of substantial leaking in the building. Many times the power goes out, the outside windows and framing around the windows is in very bad shape. The roof's in bad shape. And there's no doubt that putting this building in a position where it's restored as maybe the village like to do it will cost a lot of money. Why this guy is doing this with this building, why he wants to own it is a little bit of an imponderable to me. I'm not quite sure I can understand it, but that's what he wants to do. He originally had proposed to renovate the inside of the building and lease it out to commercial tenants, which he would have a right to do. However, under the zoning that the village passed, he can only do that if he got a special permit from planning board, which he'd have to do. He'd have to apply to subdivide the property because the property that he would now own would be a taxable entity, unlike the MTA's property. And he would have to then also apply to get additional parking, because without additional parking spots, he can't have commercial tenants in the building. And under the proposed transfer by the MTA, the only additional place for additional parking would still be on MTA property just north of the building. And so the MTA is going to get stuck in this thing no matter what, if it's going to proceed. So that's a short and sweet description of why we're here and what I have proposed. I can show you maps of the properties. So you can see what's going on. I have drawings of the building.
I have one kind of overriding huge question which is what, let's say that they put all the language we want into the deed. I still don't understand if you have a property owner, which would then be his property, that just says, I'm not doing anything. What kind of hammer do we have? Because to me, he's had a lease for 8 years, which he hasn't lived up to for 8 minutes. And now the FDA is like, oh, well, and to me, like, I don't understand, like, other than like, I just don't understand how, the MTA going, well, now the village can oversee it. Yeah, we can oversee it if he applies for permits or, special permits for usage and things like that. But to get him to actually do the restoration or maintenance, I don't understand how we have a role in that.
And I think that's fair. I honestly, again,
and my PS too, for one of your questions, why does he want to do this? He has the post office locked up. So for 50 grand, he's probably got, I don't know what the lease is there.
Yeah.
But to him, it's like you just got money for nothing, literally.
well, two things. You're right about the post office, although under the zoning requirements, he can't continue to have the post office without first getting a special permit. So he'd have to go get a special permit to even have the post office in there. But as to what the village could do, I think you're right, Brian. He could just not do anything with the building. It could sit there and the village and the things that I've asked him to be in the deed aren't necessarily going to give the village the ability to make him do that. It only would ensure that if he decides to do anything on the outside of the building, he has to do it in a certain way. So he may choose not to do anything. And he may also choose to not do anything with the exteriors of the building and just apply for a building permit to renovate the interior with the hope of bringing some tenants in there. The outside end of this is, if the building became really in bad shape and dangerous, the building at that point, it might become a nuisance or something, but it's a long way from that. That's not the situation.
Yeah.
So you're,
So I mean, other than, eventually condemning it and taking it over or something.
so you're right. What we're asking the village to do right now doesn't give the village the power to force him to renovate and repair the building. But
I was hoping I was missing something.
No, I think that's fair. But what's so odd is if he buys it, it's now going to be a taxable entity. He's got to pay taxes on it. He's going to have to apply to the planning board to get a special permit. He's have to apply to the planning board to subdivide the property. And I suspect that I may have a voice in that process and will work to make sure that the planning board looks at it very closely. And that will, that will be a time consuming process for him. So he might just do nothing, but if he does nothing and doesn't apply for a special permit, he theoretically can't do anything. He can't put any use of the building in place,
I guess,
Including the post office.
including the post
but
office.
he could turn around and sell, you know.
He could sell it.
So for 50 grand, he's basically covered with his post office revenue.
He
could
could,
now sell it for whatever.
well, he could sell it, but the question then, who is going to buy it? Because the realistic reality of this is it's an old building. It's on a very small parcel. There is not currently parking to support leasing out the building. And so he might be able to sell it, and he's going, we've talked to the MTA a lot about what they've done with other stations up and down the line, because there's other stations where not-for-profit groups have come in and have raised funds and renovated the building. And, in Phillips Manor, that building's been done, Hastings has been redone, Dobbs is on Dobbs property, but that's been redone. And so maybe a strategy is that he gets the building, then he says, I'm going to go out and try to find some not-for-profit that's well-funded to come in because they want to preserve the building. That's possible. However, but that's also an important reason why the items that I would hope that the village would tell the MTA we want in there are key. That the restricted covenants about how he has to do things runs with the land, so that if he then sells it to another owner, they're to be bound by it as well. And that it can be enforced by the village. Because if he doesn't put that in, he would make the argument that I don't have to do it. And I might argue against that, but as I say, it'll be stronger if the village is authorized to enforce it clearly.
Chad, I've walked past it many, many times, but I've never accessed the train station from or through that building. Is that something that is?
No. So the building is not,
The
no,
building is totally independent,
yes, so
and a falling down building wouldn't be a danger to commuters who are going.
So when I first moved to the village, I've used that station all my time in the village. And when you first moved in, the way to the opposite side of the tracks used to be, you would go in the building, you go upstairs, and there was a walkway from the building across to the other tracks. 10 or 11 or 12 years ago, when the MTA redid the overpasses up and down the Hudson line, they took that down and built an independent overpass over the Hudson line. So now commuters who use the train station don't have to go in that building at all. They walk right by it. We've talked to within Friends of the Ardsley train station is made up of Hudson House, Mercy College, and POA. And Mercy, had initially was very interested in potentially using it as a entrance point for students who were commuting to the village, maybe having a small coffee shop, whatever. But Mercy's taken the position that they're not going to lease it unless he fixes it up first. They want a white box. Hudson House and members of the Ardsley nearby community use the post office. And Hudson House is very anxious that the post office be continued and preserved. And they also just would like to maintain a beautifully historic building. So they have all these different interests, but whether that's enough to make it all happen, I don't know.
Yeah, it's unfortunate the poet didn't want Mercy's involvement back in 2015, because I think that would solve a lot of issues.
Yeah, I can't, that was not my fault. I can't speak to that.
Yeah, yeah, as well as a lot of the uses, I think that possibly would have made it more viable, but
So,
editorial.
right, so what I respectfully request, and actually I'm not quite sure how to do it, whether to have you, assuming you guys all want to do it, have the mayor call up and read the riot act but is.
Because I wrote a pretty stern, almost nasty letter to the MTA when we got there. Hey, we want to let you know we're doing this. And I told them it was a big mistake.
And did you get a response?
I did not.
And
Larry even called and they basically said, yep, thanks, got it, yep, saw it.
so,
I guess, can I ask a question? But my question is, I guess, really two things, like, one, other than asking them, and it seems that they're don't care, right?
I do think we'd have to get our state electeds involved.
Okay, that's, yeah, so
So
my
I-
question is, how can we push the needle, right? Because it seems like Brian's letter didn't do it. Sorry, Brian. And then also, I guess, let's say that this happens, right? And they put this information in. I'm just curious, when we say that the village could enforce it, what exactly does that mean? Because I know we've had discussions here about non-conforming properties, and other than like specifically going after that one property owner. I thought what I've heard in this room is that other than them, there being a restriction on their ability to sell, if they had some non-conforming use, then unless we were willing to sue them, what could we do? So is our only remedy suing them if they're
Okay.
non-conforming?
So to your first point, as I said, I have spoken at length to Susan Tolchin, who's a special assistant for Senator Stuart Cousins, and she is fully up to speed. And after looking at all this, she came back to me and said, the senator wants to know what the village is going to do, i.e. if the village speaks up, the senator will speak up. I've spoken to David Momora, laid this all out. He has spoken to Blanca, what her last name is, who is a planning commissioner of the Westchester County, who's on the board of the MTA. And he said as well, I need to know what the village is going to do, but I think he will speak up. And I spoke to Mary Jane Shimsky yesterday, sent her the letter, and she said, yeah, but what's the village going to do? So I'm not sure whether it'll move the needle, but what I'm hoping is that if the village can say clearly and say, I want the MTA police to do this, I will immediately convey that to Susan Tolchin and to David and to Mary Jane and request that they also do that. Whether that's going to make the MTA do it or not, I don't know. The MTA is a bit of a monolith in many ways. But that would be that. And then in terms of assuming you have these are in the deed and you have the right to enforce restricted covenant, I'll leave it to Mary Ann as to what the village could or could not do. But I think, the village, two things. One, they could sue to enforce that, I guess, and that's a little different. If you have a specific deed authorizing you to do that, that's different than just what you might do under a zoning or non-conformance under zoning law. Two, I think that having that in the deed as part of this planning board special permitting process, that might also be a vehicle to say, well, the special permit is also tied to that. That's a more complicated question, and I'll leave it to Mary Ann. I'm not a municipal law expert as Mary Ann is, and exactly. But I think you're right, Arlene, that it's not a silver bullet, and you may have to take a next step to kind of bring it down. But absent that,
Yeah. I mean, it just seems that you have obviously you have a tenant for 8 years. He's been there who hasn't really done anything. And it seems to me that he probably won't do anything after.
Again, the change is if he owns it, he is now going to start paying taxes on it. Now, whether that's going to be enough, I don't know what the taxes would be on just the building itself. And he would have to undertake to, get a special permit, and that's not a cost-free process. So again, I can't conceive of why he's doing this.
It's smarter for him to keep the lease, which he gives keep the status quo.
Right, so.
Yeah, I don't understand that.
Except if he thinks he has a buyer or something.
Or even if he doesn't have a buyer, let's say, like, I guess I'm trying to understand if it's deeded to him and you have the post office that's already there. And he needs a special permit, let's say, what's the remedy there? Because if, let's say he's like, you guys are impossible, I can't get a special permit, I'm not going to fix whatever requirements, for a special permit. Do we shut down the post office? Do you know what I mean? Like, it doesn't continue. We can't really, like, if he's entitled to the rent from that. I guess I'm trying to, so maybe Marianne, you can help me with this. Like, I'm trying to understand what would be
It would be a night.
yeah. That sounds like a night.
I think, Arlene, you hit the nail on when you first said, how do we deal with it? You deal with it by litigation. It's going to be very difficult litigation. Chad, do you have any, is the MTA open to any other possibilities here? This whole thing makes zero sense to me, zero sense. Why they're
so-
essentially giving it to him.
Right.
So
I
I had,
too.
so let me kind of.
Right, but I,
And
Let me-
wait, Chad, one other thing I want to ask you, it's not, it's important. Now, as you've talked to the MTA, have they indicated at all that I don't agree with them that they can sell this without subdividing it, but whatever. They can do it. Anybody can buy anything, but have they indicated that the MTA would further subdivide their property to give him the parking he needs, because there's no way he can do anything without some more MTA property? Have they
To that
indicated
question,
that? Yes.
the answer to that question is no. Under their lease and under their supposed settlement, stipulation of settlement, the plan is they would sell him the building, but the area that would be dedicated for the parking, which is north of it, would remain under ownership of the MTA, and the lease would continue to respect that area. And the reason for that, I think,
But he's gonna still be able to, so he's still, I was gonna ask that question, is part of this, whatever they're negotiating, is some access to parking? Do you know?
so I put it this way, he can't have any commercial tenants in the building unless he has adequate parking. He does not currently have adequate parking, so he'd have to find adequate parking somehow. He could, there's this question of whether people are buying and selling slots down at the Ardsley train station, but absent that, the way you'd have to do that is you'd have to convince the MTA to let him build a parking area on their property north of the station. And that was what was always had been
We got a
contemplated.
plan for that, I believe, he even presented.
Well, yeah, so a year in November of 2021, he submitted a proposal for that to the planning board. The proposal he submitted was so off, it had an incorrect survey, it intruded onto Nevis's property, it was just, and the planning board went, what's this? And then he dropped it, and never followed up. But going to your question, remember back your question. I'm sorry.
Well, no, okay, there were two unrelated ones, but the second one was, because it's what you're talking about now. Did the MTA indicate to you that they would either subdivide a piece of their property for him for parking, or that they would continue to lease him their piece of property for parking? Because there's no way he can do anything without the parking.
The way the structure of the deal is they would lease him that property.
Okay,
Now, whether they, that means they would have to allow him to put a parking area into that area of the property. But they would be owned by the MTA, and it would be subject to the existing lease. That's how it's structured.
okay.
Uh,
Then my other question was, is there any other option here? I mean, like, might Mercy be interested? I mean, because I don't see what MTA is getting out of this. They're not getting any more money. To me, all the MTA is getting out of this, they're getting it off their hands.
can I ask a
Seems
follow-up
to
question?
me.
I've been thinking of a question now through the whole thing, and I think Mary Ann's moving in that direction, which is, I'm to understand that the lease was given in 2015.
Correct.
They have not performed.
Correct.
The MTA has been suggesting they are in breach of the lease, and in the negotiation of that is when they came up with the solution of just giving them the property, right? It's exactly right. So what I was thinking is, if the goal of the MTA is to get out of this, right? Would they be amenable to another offer? Say, if the village were willing to say, we will assume the place of the MTA, right? And then we could
Oh,
act,
Mercy.
or Mercy, if they are interested.
So let me explain that. So I've had many conversations with David Florio, the head of real estate operations, about this possibility. The problem with the MTA is, so stepping back, they terminated this lease. They actually the lease was terminated December 2nd, 2019. He didn't leave. They brought a holdover proceeding in justice court here and got a judgment and a warrant of eviction. And then the pandemic hit and they were barred from evicting him. So they waited until that lifted in January of 2022, and they went back into justice court to get a new warrant of eviction. He then came in and made a motion to dismiss, which Justice Lyons denied. He then appealed it to the appellate term and got a stay in the appellate term over any eviction. So that's where it's been sitting for the last 8 months. I have talked to David Florio about alternatives because he kept insisting to me they wanted to get him out and then look for other alternatives. And so possible alternatives. I've spoken to Mercy about whether Mercy wants to potentially buy it. I can't speak for Mercy, but they have not stepped up to do that. I've talked to Hudson House, at least the people I'm working with in Hudson House. I can't speak for Hudson House, but they have not stepped up to do that. And I think, you know, it would be a big undertaking. I've talked to the MTA about the other complication is if the MTA terminates this lease and gets him out of there to do anything with the property, they have a very, according to David Florio, a somewhat complicated RFP process they have to go to under by state law. And they've got to put it out there, they got to put bids out and whatever. And so they'd have to do that. And I've talked to him about, even if we don't have a neighborhood group that is in a position to actually put the money up and buy the building, I have a lot of neighborhood folks that are supportive of protecting it. And I would be willing to work with some other group if we could find them and support that process. Hasn't happened. I think in reality, what's going on here, and to be fair to the guy I've been doing with the MTA, is first the pandemic hit and all the real estate shut down. Then Ida happened last year, and that destroyed even more stuff. And this is a small problem in the larger real estate portfolio problems the MTA has. And it's become a pain in the rear. And so they have just decided, they crossed the Rubicon to say, just get rid of it. And here's a ready guy who seems, for whatever reason, willing to take it. And they just want to get rid of it. And I think that's what's going on. So, but I don't know. They're pretty far down the pathway. What's interesting, by the way, is this whole settlement is premised upon DeGennaro having done certain things. He had to submit plans to the village that were other. He hasn't done that. He is supposed to submit up meets and bounds. He hasn't done it. Under his lease, he had to subdivide the property. He hasn't done it.
So they don't seem to care.
So I said to David Florio when I spoke to him last week, I said, David, none of this has happened. He goes, yeah, that's probably right. He won't admit that, but this is the plan they're on, they're pushing forward.
So
Now,
they wouldn't listen if someone stepped up.
I don't know if they would listen to someone. I don't know that. He hasn't listened to me. But I am not the person who's been able to offer him any real alternatives. And I'm also not the person who can say to him, there's consequences to you if you don't listen to me. You know, I'm a persuasive guy, but I'm just a guy. So what the hell can you do? So I don't know if, that's why I actually would love it if, you know, Senator Stuart Cousins showed up and said, let me tell you something, this is a dumb idea. And I think this is in it, you know, if you hadn't do this, you may have the right to do that, but I'm going to remember you did this. Again, that's not how the senator would do. She'd be much more diplomatic about it, but that's what I've been trying and scrambling to pull together if I can, but I'm not there yet. In part because I need you guys.
Yeah, and I spoke to Dave and David Imamura and Mary Jane Shifsky as well. They kind of said the same thing. Like, what does the village want to do? And you know, I think for Larry Schopfer and myself and the board talked about this as well. Like, we didn't see a clear role for us. I mean, other we could ask. And you know, I think we'll all be happy to, you know, have you craft a firmly worded letter for us to sign.
It's more, I hope it's more firm than Brian.
So this is not the letter. But this is, so again, I can't,
Just one.
but this is the language from my letter of what I would think would be good if the village could write to the MTA
Audience.
and write to the MTA and say, and this is exactly what was in my letter.
Yeah.
The letter would go to David Florio, who's head of real estate operations. It would go to Andrew Booter, who is the head of government relations, who's been talking to the hand the whole time. And there's another woman named Jennifer Berry. That's the people I've been dealing with. I think David Florio is the guy who makes the ultimate call on this. If the village writes that letter, I would immediately request that David Amora do that, Senator Cousins of that, Mary Jane Shibsky. Whether that's gonna make the difference, I don't know.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, I don't see any downside for
Me
us
neither. No.
doing this letter. It's also interesting timing that the speaker Hastie's also coming to Irvington in August. So what I would do is I'd copy Understewart Cousins, Speaker Hastie, Mary Jane, David Amora, George Latimer. Like I put everybody on the CC there.
Jamal,
Yeah,
Why not?
and University College, the new president, like I fill everybody's inbox, and then hopefully that there's some pressure on the MTV, because I do think that the state, similar to Con Ed, it's to me, the only people they listen to are the people that are on the board of, the state agencies that pull some of the purse strings. I mean, obviously the MTA has their own purse strings, but they, it's,
And I think that's a great idea. Bluntly, you're much more persuasive in getting them to do that perhaps than I am. I've worked hard at it, but I will make that happen instantly if I can. I
Okay.
will make that happen. That's what I do. And so, if the board is willing to do this, I will have in your hands tomorrow morning a letter to those guys with that language.
Yeah.
And that you need to look at with Mary Ann
Yeah.
and make sure it
I think that
doesn't.
makes sense. Why don't
Yeah,
we-
that's fine.
Mary
Is
Ann,
it
can I just ask-
possible, neither Larry Agrodnik nor I can know what's in the letter?
Oh, so Mary Ann, all I've given them is the language.
Those three
that-
things,
on the second
but
page
does
of
not ask for another option. I mean, it sort of avoids what. And
Yes, I
I'm not
understand.
saying that the village would take it, but that they just wait and see if there's another option.
And honestly, again, I don't know what the village can or cannot do, and it's not my place to suggest something like that. So I don't know.
I'm not, understand me, I'm not suggesting that the village take it over by any means. But it seems that there are other interested parties there that might be.
I mean, I almost think we have to start off the letter by saying we think what your course of action is a mistake. And then saying if you continue with this mistake, you have to at least do these three things. However, we'd much prefer that you wait and do not transfer the deed to and that sort of thing. Because I agree, Mary Ann, it just doesn't make any sense long-term or short-term.
No, no.
Puzzling, it's puzzling
Other
that.
than the MTV does the MTA does not work.
One of the other things that's really disturbing to me was that this settlement that was put in court said things that were absolutely not true. And they signed off on it about the, he submitted everything he needed to get these things, and that all this certain work required a permit. And it's not true that all that work required a permit. There was things he could have done that didn't require a permit.
And he didn't obtain the permits. And he made a
No,
best
the
a
two
half-hearted-
parts, yes, there were things he could do that didn't require a permit. And then he didn't do the follow-up on the permits, right?
Yeah.
But the thing that was so weird was the MTA's requirement was not that he get the permit, was that he apply for the permit. It was really weird.
And what's also interesting, Mary Ann, is that the terminology they used, they didn't define what he had to submit. It was just
No.
planned.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was,
It
again,
wasn't even submit a complete application. It was like submit plans or something,
Mary Ann, can I ask you if this transfer goes through, does the village's position is the village's position any different if it goes through with or without these requests that Chet has?
I think it's different. I mean, I don't want to, I'd rather not do this in public, but I think I would want to hear what Chet's arguments were for what the village could do in the absence of enforcement.
Right. So let me put it this way, Larry. I would go guns blazing to stop any of this nonsense. As I said, however, I think the village's position would be stronger with that language. I don't concede that without it, the village couldn't have plenty of remedies, but it would be stronger with that language.
And did the MTA reach out to Brian and the village because of a legal requirement to do it, or was it just a courtesy that
I think it was a courtesy.
And let me also just say, David Florio, he's a good guy, I think, in certain ways, but he plays very close to the vest. And he didn't say they're not doing this. He just said the language is being negotiated. I can't say more. And I'm concerned that I'm not sure how that's all being translated to council and whatever, and whether it's going to be what the village really needs. I think you need to be more stringent.
I was gonna say, or that the language, the sort of the thought would be there, but the words won't be right, which won't really get you where you need to be.
That's absolutely correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely correct.
I still think it's important, if it's at all possible, to try and find another route here.
And I think that's fine. I must say that I have been scratching my head and I don't have another route to consider. We've talked a lot about, I've approached Mercy. In the Friends, Tom Simmons, who is the head of operations at Mercy, has been on all of our calls. And I've talked to Tom about this. He knows exactly what's going on and whatever. And, I suggested maybe Mercy step up, and he hasn't done that for whatever reason. On our Friends board, there are 3 residents of Hudson House, and through them, I've asked them to go to the Hudson House board and raise these issues. They, I think, have done that, and the Hudson House is concerned about this. But as of yet, Hudson House hasn't called me up and said, Chet, we'll take it on. And again, they're right. That's okay. So I don't have another. I approached, we considered, historic Hudson Valley and other places, but they don't have the right connection to this thing. So I'm not sure where to turn. And I'd love ideas, but I just don't know where to turn.
That's why we can at least delay the transfer. Because I mean, like right now, if the eviction was at the 5-yard line, and it didn't happen. Because to me, if you had a new lease, I know they have to go through an RFP process or whatever. But I feel that you could get someone that would at least, from the beginning, this seemed on when he would come and, people would be saying, it shouldn't be used for anything other than a post office. And then Larry and I would be like, but we think these would be good uses. And then he'd be sitting there like quietly. And I remember after one time I said, I'm not sure why you think we should be advocating for your uses, because it doesn't make any sense. Maybe you should speak about what you think it should be used for. And he's like, I'm fine. It was a very strange, the whole.
So I can't speak for that.
Right.
I have reached out to him several times. He has never responded to me. I think I'm not on his Christmas card list. So,
So, I think a letter helps. I think to me, the goal is more to delay it if we can than to, as a backup plan, to get this language into a deed, because, I think we at least all agree that it's not like this is a magic bullet that allows us to get the renovation done. It's more of like, it gives us a door that's heavy and expensive to open to potentially pursue things. And without it, you're going with the land. To me, it's, that's a real disaster. Right. I think the only thing we have is that we have the special permit. That's our only real, because even if they gave it to somebody new without any deed restrictions, you still need a special permit to do anything. So, but again, I don't know how much of a, it's definitely not a carrot, but I don't know how much of a stick it is either, other than, saying you have to make repairs.
I also, again, I can't speak for Mr. Gennaro, and I had originally reached out to him to say, I'd like to work with you to find a solution. It's a very challenging problem. It's a very challenging problem. And people who would like to preserve the building and let him use it commercially as the zoning allows, but still preserve it. I just got nothing and I don't know why.
And it's, and honestly, like when, Larry and I met them a couple times, but again, as you say, it was usually like after a meeting for 2 minutes. It wasn't, like sit down and tell us what your vision is for the place. And I think that was what we couldn't ever get. That was never articulated what his vision was. It was maybe an office space, maybe a cafe. The post office is good. It was like there was never, and usually when you go into something like this, you have a very detailed plan. And this is the steps. And then he basically said, once I rent it out, I'll start working on the renovations. And it was kind of like, cart before the horse kind of thing. Which I guess if you're coming into this with very little money or something, it makes sense. You rent it, you build up some money and then you fix it. But I mean, that plan doesn't usually work. So if the whole thing's strange, if we could somehow get the MTA, at least not to make this a permanent transfer to a tenant that doesn't seem to be working out very well.
Yeah, I know, except they're talking about a 2-week time period for a contemplated move. And we have no track record of them responding to anything that we've done in the first place. And all we do is ask them to delay. And now it's September 5th and they don't.
Yeah.
We haven't asked to get this wording into.
Well, I think we do both parts.
Yeah,
I think we asked, and you said, if you're not going to delay, then please put this language in.
Yeah,
and I think we have to-
some the out not to delay.
But then we have to hope that
There's not a lot of time.
that the state electeds can put some pressure.
Okay, so I guess my request is how can I help in that process? I don't want to intrude and I don't want to be presumptuous, but if there's something I can do to.
I mean, if you wanted to take a crack at a drafted letter, send it to me, I can edit it and then send it to the board, then we can send it to Mary Ann and Larry.
That's fine.
I think I think it's that first draft that's always the hardest, and I think you have a lot of it here.
So I have to be upstate for half of tomorrow, but I can get it by the end of tomorrow too.
Perfect.
So
So we'll try to get it to the board by, Friday midday for the wordsmithing, and to Mary Ann and Larry as well, so.
Does this have to be voted on at the next meeting?
No.
No? Okay.
okay, any other questions? Or again, I really appreciate the time.
No, I mean, I do think it just needs to be structured and like maybe first setting out that he's a bad tenant, this is a bad idea, there needs to be an alternative. This is not in the interest of anyone, and then if you want to proceed with this anyway, we request that you do X. I
think that's exactly right.
I would start.
You lead with this is a bad idea.
Yeah,
There
we
has
don't
to be a better
support this.
solution.
Yeah, we don't support this. This is a
But-
tenant you were gonna evict
Yeah, exactly. It's very strange.
twice.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Chad.
Yeah, thanks, Chet.
That is not the.
Next up, presentation of Irvington's government greenhouse gas inventory.
Hi.
Welcome.
Make sure this is showing up.
Look at that.
Yeah.
Boom.
Great.
Let's take a response meeting.
Right. All the stuff in the way.
Isn't the shortcut at the
Yeah,
bottom?
that's
Isn't the one,
I actually use Google Slides normally.
oh,
I just exported this to be white. Same as the backup.
that one right there?
Yeah,
There
okay,
you go.
thank you. Great, so this is the inventory results for the village greenhouse gas emissions and switch. There we go. Which was a project of the Climate Action Planning Institute that was led by the Hudson Valley Regional Council, funded by the DEC Climate Smart Communities Grant, and guided by the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, ICLEI. There were 9 municipalities involved, it's still ongoing. It's 16 months, starting February 2023, ending in August of 2024. We have 12 meetings and 2 reports. This is the first report, which is the greenhouse gas inventory. The next is the actual plan for reduction of emissions. So this is a sort of, I modified, the report is ultimately for climate smart communities to get points. And I've modified it slightly today for you as an audience, but this is for them, a bit of context about the village, where we are, our population, et cetera, a bit of contextual history, all of which you already know. In terms of our environmental history, we're a clean energy community. We've achieved already 10 actions for 5,200 points. We have a whole bunch of new ones we're going to be doing soon, which I'll talk about at the end. We're bronze certified climate smart community, and the village has participated in grid rewards and energy smart homes programs. For the inventory, the year selected was 2019 because it's a year we could still get data for, looking back, which was before pandemic madness, and so representative of a more typical year. And all the municipalities did this year together. Most municipalities had to go through a process of collecting data from NIPA and Con Edison, but we were fortunate that we have been using something called Facility Dude since 2010. It's now called Energy Manager, and I think Nikki Coddington really was responsible for us implementing that. It's been huge and instrumental in us having really pure data, and Larry and his team have been uploading information. Is that you? Yeah, that's your
Disappointed.
A little bit.
Disappointed the name change. I always like.
Me too, yeah.
I was thinking the same.
Hilarious.
So let me laugh
Like a
every
bunch of
time we
kids
heard
started
it.
out
Yeah. It's like,
Anyway, it's really was like separated us from everyone in terms of the amount of data we had access to and how much it streamlined the process for us, and continues to be, I think going forward will continue to be incredibly helpful tool. Everyone else is copying us now on that. Our focus includes government owned and run buildings and facilities, the vehicle fleet, streetlights and water pump station, nothing residential or school related. And we need to say that we have no substantial refrigerants of note because they are very high impact emissions, but we do and always have, I mean, since I moved here, recycled our residential refrigerators and AC units properly, which is important. And we have no wastewater facilities, which are significant for other municipalities. So in terms of the overall emissions, it's 1,119 total metric tons, with the biggest contributor being the vehicle fleet at 515, followed by buildings and facilities, 329, and employee commute, 260, and then water and streetlights are negligible after that. I'll go into each of these in a bit more detail. The vehicle fleet being the biggest was basically we have our own pumps, gas and diesel, and Larry was able to extrapolate from that the overall impact, but it was harder to drill down and say which cars, because we don't have an inventory. We don't keep track, or at least I haven't seen, Larry hasn't provided an inventory of consumption by vehicle, but I could do an analysis of the vehicle miles traveled divided by the miles per gallon rating in the city, and came up with the biggest offender vehicles, which are a big significant part of our overall emissions. Larry's already really aware, obviously, of which ones have the worst ratings and which we use the most. And he's already several years ago applied for electric vehicles to replace these, and there just isn't the inventory. So we're a little bit hands tied on this front, but we are endeavoring to mitigate this already. And one of the other interesting factors that made it hard to determine our impact was that a lot of our service vehicles, like the fire trucks, are actually emitting a lot while standing still. So we can't even look at the odometer as a metric point. It's idling, exactly. I'm just changing some of this. There we go. So buildings and facilities, the next component is interesting. This is the CO2 equivalent. In other words, across natural gas, oil, and electricity. You can see who has the biggest emissions. It's town hall. We win. We also have the police department and the theater. So that is significant. And as you know, the HVAC system for the theater is already being overhauled. However, we're also introducing air conditioning, so that might net out to not much better than we are now. After that, we have the fire station, senior center, and South Buckout office tying at 14%. And if you combine the mechanical garage, sanitation garage, and highway garage, it's also 14%. We are in the process, almost done, I think, working on overhauling the HVAC system for the senior center. And we know we have a big plan for the fire station. So those are underway. So just a bit of a drill down, you can see specifically by natural gas. Oh, the version that you guys are looking at is probably, I've done some updating on this one on the screen, so might not quite match up. For natural gas, you can see it's the South Buckhead office. For oil, it's the mechanical garage. You know, we can look at these and see where we can create goals next, which is the next phase of this climate action plan. In terms of kilowatt hours, it was really notable. The library was significantly higher than any other building, so much so that I went in and did an analysis by month. And it's really clear that it's summertime. It's the AC system that was at fault. And actually, apparently there was literally a faulty system. And that was replaced in 2022. And I'm really excited about doing another inventory to compare how it's changed. In terms of employee commute, approximately 45% of our 80 full-time equivalent employees responded. They drive an average of 17 miles to work one way, basically 5 days a week. You can see how we calculated emissions there. The other thing that came with the employee commute was a survey, which I thought was really interesting. And a lot of people responded. They said they would consider alternatives if they could be guaranteed, alternative to driving their vehicles, if they could be guaranteed a ride home in the event of an emergency, which I can imagine we should be able to offer. A number of people said they would consider public transport if there were compensation. So I want to look into if there's any grant opportunities for municipal employees to take public transportation. Quite a few drive SUVs. Half of them said they would be interested in hooking up to Village EV charging if that was offered. And Larry said, well, maybe we can piggyback on the EV fleet chargers that are being installed. So that could be an interesting solution. I identified 5 zip codes with 2 or more people living in them who are commuting. And, we can look into incentives and opportunities to create more rideshare opportunities. Streetlights, really negligible, mainly because we already converted them to LED in 2016 and 2017. If you look at other municipalities who haven't done it, the streetlights are, possibly the biggest emitters, depending on what's happening in their municipality. But that was a huge, huge difference that we've already made. The water pumps, negligible. In terms of takeaways and next steps, this is really old. I've changed it a lot up here. We are working on a tree inventory, and I don't want to report on it until I have it finalized, but it's really significant what our Irvington woods and street trees do in terms of sequestration and balancing out our emissions. So that's valuable to see and understand their impact. I do think now that we have this process in place and we have the data from Facility Dude, I'll keep calling it that. I think that's where these charts and these spreadsheets get really interesting, because you can really see what's happening from one year to the next year. I mean, we can even go back to when we first set it up to see how the LED lights change things, for example. And I think you guys are almost up to date on catching up recent bills.
Yeah, I think this week we uploaded July.
So there was some change in systems, and so we got behind, but now we're almost caught up. And then when we can do our most recent year, and I really think that's going to be revealing in terms of what changes are having what impact. The next step of this process is to create the climate action plan. Starting in September with the same group, we will work on mitigation strategies and identifying what our emissions reduction goals are. And then in the spring, we'll work to present the findings to stakeholder groups in the community, get feedback, formalize the plan, and ask you guys to adopt it. All in, by next summer, this will qualify us for an additional 16 climate smart communities points. And separate but related goings on. I'm in the process of enrolling us for a similar greenhouse gas inventory, not for municipal buildings, but for residential buildings. And there's a similar facilitating process. They already have a lot of the data, so it will be streamlined, I think. next, when Larry's back, we'll give it to you guys. We have a simple resolution for you to pass to say, yes, we would like to participate in this community greenhouse gas inventory, and I'll manage it. That will also qualify us for another 16 climate smart community points. In terms of climate smart communities, we need basically another 100 to get to silver status. For these two programs, I think we feel confident we can fill in the rest, no problem. There's a lot of new money on the table for clean energy communities, and particularly community campaigns. I'm launching one now regarding EVs, and you'll see a lot of noise about that. And I encourage you to tell everyone. And if we get, I mean, first 5 buyers, we get, I don't remember how many thousands are, but there's like tens of thousands of dollars on the table for grants. If we get people to buy either electric vehicles or lease or plug-in hybrids, and we just need to know that they're doing it. So there's going to be potentially an EV vendor fair during Rocktoberfest. I'm waiting to hear back from Parks, but there's a lot of stuff in the works there that I think is going to be fun and exciting. I just launched an EV club, and already today my inbox blew up with people who want to be in this club. So that's really fun. And then I'm rolling out, we have our Irvington Green monthly meetings at this point. It's first Wednesday of the month, except for August. And I'm adding onto it a series of climate talks with, some incredible brain trust in Westchester. We have all these like global environmental leaders, and they're going to talk about global issues and bring it down to really specifically local strategies for mitigation and resilience and all kinds of interesting different approaches and things that they focus on, which also will get us points for climate smart communities, that sort of thing, but will also just be really interesting. So I hope you guys all come. So just closing out to say thanks for everyone. Thanks for Larry Schopfer and Karen, who really collected the data, streamlined the process for myself, and Nikki Coddington and Warwick Norton, who were volunteers to put together the report. Mary Lambert has been totally incredible from the Hudson Valley Regional Council, guiding the entire process, and the ICLEI staff. And to you guys for all of your investments in energy efficiency over the years that helped us get as far as we are already. So that's it. You have
Great.
questions on that front?
That's great.
No, I mean, it's interesting to see the 2019 numbers
Yeah.
and to know that we're already so far ahead of those
Right.
numbers.
And we already have so many plans in place. So, but it'll help us to drill down,
Right.
figure out where the gaps are, which buildings we haven't considered, and what's the next low hanging fruit. But, I mean, Larry, you guys already did the really big opportunities. So now it's more nuanced. Yeah.
Great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
this
Yeah, thank
next
you.
one. Yeah. I'm also part of the next thing on the agenda.
Discussion of a native tree policy.
Yeah, but I think since Chet and I have already spoken, maybe Alan should.
You and Alan should. I'm just again.
We have 3 seats.
Yeah, we
Really,
I'm just
Alan,
pull
I
up
want
another
you to be
chair.
the speaker.
Yeah.
You did the last
can
one.
slide over.
Yeah, we have plenty of room. We're missing 2 Larrys in person. We have plenty of room.
Yeah.
Are you gonna say back there?
Okay. I'll bring it back.
So I approached Charlotte, I'll go back, about the idea of a native tree policy for the village, because some of you may know, I'm in the chair of the tree commission for 7 years now, 6-7 years.
Yes, right.
Both. Everybody in the village hates me. Anyway, so, no, that's not true. People love actually being informed about the trees. It's really fantastic when you enter into a conversation with people when you go to their property. It's really amazing. So, and then she told me that Chad also had been interested in this, not just for trees, but also for other plants in the village and the work he's been doing in other areas in this field. And so he likewise had an interest in approaching a piece of legislation that would pull together our thoughts on trees, but also on other native plants. Chet was able to provide a large number of pieces of legislation from different municipalities in Westchester, but also Connecticut and New Jersey, that gave us different viewpoints on ways to approach this. Westchester has a policy, Tarrytown has a policy. I would say Westchester, Tarrytown, and Larchmont have the same policy. They're all almost identical. But then there are other things. Some are more aspirational, some are more in terms of prohibitions. Different municipalities come down to different areas. Some deal with just trees, some do trees perennials, some do trees perennials annuals. So there's a lot to parse there in terms of what we want to take on and what makes sense for the community. We pulled together a list of bulleted points. We started writing a draft, but we decided it might be better to present you with bulleted points of what we're thinking about, because we need to hear back from you what your reaction is to these things. And if it seems like we're going in a direction that's just not going to work for the village, it'd be better to know before we start drafting the legislation. We have enough of these for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks. Okay, so you can see here that it's basically what I've been telling you. The Green Policy Task Force, Chad and myself, are working on this resolution. Our goal is to promote sustainable landscapes and biodiversity through the use of native plants. We want to reduce the impact of invasive plants, support the village's climate change initiatives, and potentially reduce landscape expenses. The policy we are looking at would apply only to the village, not to homeowners at all. And any village funded projects requiring landscaping or purchase of planting. The policy would only apply to future plantings. We are not considering that we would be ripping plants out of the ground, except for the possibility of invasive plant species eradication. You know, that's a different thing. Other municipalities have implemented this. Like I said, Tarrytown is New York State, Ridgeville, Connecticut, Montclair. It was interesting. I had a conversation today with the tree, I don't know if he's called the warden or the commissioner or what, of Tarrytown, to find out how it's being implemented there. They've had the policy for over 10 years, and he says that they are 100% native on their trees now. They don't have some of the challenges we have. They don't have overhead wires on Broadway, and they don't have overhead wires on Main Street, and that makes a huge difference. They also have wider sidewalks and setbacks on their Main Street than we do, which makes a big difference with pedestrian traffic and trucks. And I'll get to why that's a problem in a couple of minutes. But he said they're 100% now. I pointed out a couple of places that I saw in Tarrytown, but they're not natives. And he said they're probably not administered by the village. Like 119, for example, he thinks that median strip on 119 going towards White Plains is probably administered by the state, possibly the town, but I don't think so, because as soon as you hit the Greenberg town line, there's no planting at all. It's just weeds. But in the Tarrytown area,
Native weeds.
yeah, there's a whole string of teen crimson maples planted, and they're newly planted, but he thinks they're planted by the state, not by Tarrytown. And if you do go down to the train station, you see all the new planting down there. It's quite beautiful. I mean, it's all native trees, and native grasses and perennials. And there were odd things in talking to him, because their policy is pretty specific. I thought that it's all plants, right?
Yeah.
But in my conversation with him, he said, no, we don't include annuals and perennials. So clearly within Tarrytown, they created a policy, but they're not adhering to a policy, because if you go down Broadway, there are hanging planters, cascading geraniums on every street pole, and they're not native. And it's true in most of their planters. They're daylilies and lantana, and lots of plants that aren't native in the planters. So he didn't have an answer for me about how that's happening, or who's giving exceptions, or what's going on there. So the village is in pretty good shape in terms of doing this. From what I understand from talking to Larry, is our RFPs already require native plants mostly. There have been some recent events. How do you address these things politically? The village, the Parks Department planted some trees that made some people very unhappy. And so it did come forward that maybe we weren't planting native trees in our parks. I kind of think that's been corrected. It's sort of self-corrected, because once we all became aware of it, I think that policy has changed. So I think within our departments, I work with the DPW already. Todd Smith and I have a really good relationship. I the trees, or he buys them, but I pick them. And they plant them, so I have had a personal goal over the last few years of getting us to 80% native trees. And we're there now in the last 2 years of planting. So within our departments, I think we're already doing a lot of this. You may ask, why did I think it was important? I have residents asking me why I require them to plant native trees with their replant agreements. Well, I have nothing in village code that tells me I can do that. I simply have to say it's administrative. It would be great if we actually had something in the code that backed that up and said, this is village policy.
But I thought you were saying that it didn't, restrict homeowners. That
This wouldn't, but if we had a stated village policy that this is what the village stands for, and believes, then I can say to homeowners, actually, it says in here that replant agreements, what we've been working on, replant agreements would require native trees.
and it says that in the Tarrytown and
No.
the Westchester
No,
County.
they don't.
So we're looking to
Yeah.
do something over and above.
Yes.
What the
Yeah.
other communities are
Yes,
by telling homeowners and then replant things that they need to do.
Right. now we would never tell homeowners that they have to plant native trees on their own. This is only because it's an agreement with the village, and the village has a policy of planting native trees. So we do make allowances. People come back to us and can show us good reason why the location where they want to plant a native tree will work. We usually give them a variance, so we're not really that hard nosed on it, but I think we get about 99% compliance on that request from homeowners.
Forgive me, but I'm indoorsy, so.
You're
please,
what?
Indoorsy.
Okay.
That's a Jim Gaffigan joke. I didn't write this. I don't understand why is it, I'm sure it's important, but I would like to be educated. Why is it important to have native trees?
Well, native trees are important for a lot of reasons. I may need more backup on this, Chad.
Yeah,
But
so-
there's carbon sequestration. Trees in general are the most important thing we have for sequestering carbon.
But native trees sequester more.
Do they sequester more? I think they do.
So,
actually.
I can't answer that question. I think one of the things that have driven me to propose to native plants, native trees has to do with its relationship with other animal systems that are tied to those native trees. There's a symbiotic relationship between specifically pollinators and whatever that only can reproduce and be supported by certain native plants and not by other non-native plants. I'll give you an example. The oak tree, which is one of the trees, supports hundreds of different kinds of pollinators that are very important to maintaining biodiversity and environmental sustainability in the community. And if you don't have those native plants around that support all those animals, the insects fail, birds then fail, it just cascades down. So that is the big driver. I don't know whether native trees necessarily sequester carbon more than others. I don't know the answer to that.
Right.
I think the other problem often with non-native plants, and this is not true of all non-native plants, but many of them can be aggressive, and you could have native plants that are aggressive as well, but you particularly want plants that are in tune with the ongoing environmental diversity of our environment. Up in O'Hara Nature Center, what they have been doing is ensuring they're only putting native plants when they're thinking about regenerating the forest for those seasons.
Biodiversity is the big issue right now in climate change and trying to protect biodiversity. And native plants benefit biodiversity because they work with the habit that they've evolved in and animals in the fauna that are in the same area. Invasive, I don't want to say invasive plants, non-native plants do. So you may have a non-native plant that comes in and pollinators can use it. They can't actually lay their eggs on it. And when those eggs hatch, they can't feed on it. So in a way, it's stealing pollinators, it's stealing other fauna away from the native.
Right, you want so then my understanding is that you want the trees to work with our biome, right, okay.
Because it increases biodiversity, increase biodiversity, that's when more carbon sequestration comes in. Because the greater your biodiversity, the more carbon is
And
sequestered.
there's all kinds of watershed protections, all kinds of route to having a basic healthy ecosystem.
Right, you want to have the ecosystem that works. right?
It's an interesting question though, because, you know, all plants have roots, and so we talk about rainwater runoff, and we talk about prevent climate change and flooding. Well, yes, all trees have roots, and it is true, they all do hold the soil together, but they don't hold the soil together in the same way. Because there are other things that are going on under there with mycorrhiza and all the insects that are living under there and are feeding on those roots. And it becomes a whole system that stabilizes soil and helps with water retention.
Got it. Thank you. I appreciate the explanation.
Yeah. Believe me, I'm having a hard time keeping all this in my head.
Mhm.
Where were we? So we are, right now, we've been talking about the idea that the policy would be 100% native. Pretty much across the board. I mean, starting with the parks in particular. I mean, I thought long and hard about where the parks might need a reason not to plant native trees, and I really can't come up with one. I mean, there are no overhead wires per se. There are small,
It could be any shape.
they can be any shape. There are small planting strips sometimes, but we don't have to put a tree there like we have to put a tree between a sidewalk and a curb. We would love to hear from the Parks Department if they have any reasons they think, you know, they need a carve out or a lower percentage, but I couldn't think of any policy. We feel like the rest of the properties in the village, and there aren't many. I think most of the rest of the property would be managed by DPW, by the water department. And who else? I can't think who else.
Well, doesn't the beautification committee do plantings?
That's through the Parks Department, yeah.
Included in,
Yeah.
I think in any.
Yeah. So on all other properties, we came up with this idea of 100% native, except for street trees. And I can talk to you in particular about street trees because I have to pick up the trees for the streets. And it's hard to find ones that don't live sidewalks, ones that can stand up to the stress of the limited rainwater sometimes a year, flooding at other times of the year, salt in the winter, exhaust fumes from the cars, limbs growing sideways into pedestrians' eyes or into the beverage truck trying
sounds
to
painful.
deliver the beverage truck trying to deliver Coca-Cola to Jordanes, you know, those trees get broken almost every time a truck pulls in there. So there are a lot of constraints, and we try to find very particularly shaped trees. Right now, we're working with this upside down urn, it's called, to get the trees, the limbs up and away from pedestrians and trucks. We like flowering trees. I'm not dead set on flowering trees, but I was told when I took over this job that I had to keep some flowering trees on Main Street. We try to, because I know people do love them in the spring. So we end up with a very limited selection of trees we can actually put on Main Street. As we get onto the small side streets, we have more options. You know, there's more availability, more trees we can use, and that's where we've been getting our 80% trees and also in outlying areas of the village. So my 20% right now is almost all Main Street, and it's because these cherry trees that we've been planting are not native. But they do fit the street absolutely perfectly, and they're growing in. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but they're not overtaking the wires. They've got a beautiful shape. Even in the strange year, they're still green and gorgeous. And it's really hard to find a tree that can stand up to the street conditions and stress like those trees have.
So in some ways, we're over and above Terrytown, and in some ways we're not. We're not saying 100% of the trees, we're saying 80%. But also there's more recognition of like climate changes and, you know, the fact that it might need non-native trees to respond to a warmer climate. There's other variables that are actually, maybe 10 years ago, the policy didn't take that into account.
Right. So the policy would also prohibit the planting of any of the invasive species on the New York State invasive species list. Reason for that, why that's in this policy with native plants, is that invasive species drive out, push out native plants. So it's part of trying to help the native plants reestablish in the woods in the different parts of the village, is getting rid of the invasive species as much as we can. And then I came up with this idea of creating a what did we call it? Oh, the native tree administrator,
Oh, me.
which I was proposing might be our sustainability coordinator, or it might be whoever the village administrator thinks that is,
Me or someone
who
else.
would be the point person to meet with the different departments and committees to make sure that we're meeting these goals and these things are actually being enacted. I mean, I think it's one of the problems I saw with a lot of the legislation was there really was no enforcement. There was no, at the end of the day, like Terrytown not being able to tell me why they're planning annuals when their policy clearly says they're not. And so I think the policy really should have a somebody that can address that and enforce things. And then finally, we have issues. I think there are probably more than these, but questions we have already addressed. For example, our plazas. We have the Madam CJ Walker Plaza, we have the Veteran Memorial Plaza. Are they included or are they accepted? Do we consider that they are places that need to be beautified and should therefore be able to have more floriferous plantings, things that are going to stay in flower all year long? And people like those things. I mean, a lot of people love those plazas. And I think it's something to think about exactly how we're going to address that.
Can I ask the question?
Mhm.
Even though I have a native plant patch in the front of my house that my husband's been working on for like 4 years. Have you seen that little corner in my house? Oh, it's on the review road on the corner. It's a very funny patch of gardening. We're the only place where the sun comes to my house, but for Memorial Plaza and Madam CJ Walker Plaza, I guess the work of the beautification committee, they usually, I guess, put in planting, like, just like those plants, right, that you bring in. I don't think there's nothing there that's like permanent, right?
The Memorial Plaza has permanent,
Like trees.
there are dogwoods, there are arborvitae,
okay.
there are hydrangeas. Some of it's native, some of it's not. The beautiful hydrangeas there right now are not native. The arborvitae are, the dogwoods are, so it's mixed. It's mixed.
Okay.
And out here in front, I did a little survey. It's about 25% native
Okay.
out front of CJ Walker Plaza here.
So, I'm sorry. Underlying some of this is there is, again, Alan knows so much more about this than I do, but there are a range of different aesthetic looks that native plants can bring. Some can be just as beautiful as, non-native plants, whatever, but it's a different range. And some of it works in certain places and maybe not immediately for other people in other places. And so part of this would be an education policy, educating the community about why this is important, and the village would be taking a lead on that. But that's not something that happens overnight. And I think that trying to be sensitive to that and understand that that's part of why, what happens to Madam C. Walker, and people like a certain look to it. And can you do that with native plants? Or is that more challenging?
Or maybe even like a different look, right? That you get sort of used to a different,
Yeah,
like a different.
But you're
aesthetic.
right, that may be a different look, but that is something that people will have to absorb over time.
Yeah.
And
Or-
so,
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
No, go ahead.
no, I'm done.
For example, the divider at the top of the hill. It's all planted with the New Guinean patience right now. I mean, they're gorgeous all summer. And the reason they're chosen by communities is because they bloom as long as there's no freezing. And so they're just going to go on and on and on. When you put in native plantings, they don't bloom like that. They usually have windows throughout the year where they look good and then something else comes in. So if you go to the playground, the new playground down at Matheson, you've seen that there's been a succession all year of things
I
blooming.
was there this weekend, it was beautiful.
It's gorgeous. Right now.
Absolutely.
And this is the prime time for native plants. They're gorgeous now. But there are things that come in early in the season and then something else comes in, but you really cannot plant one plant. It's going to bloom its head off all summer, the way a tropical will. So it's a very different thing. So annuals are a good question, really, because annuals are what you're talking about, what the beautification community uses in planters. And all of those plants are planted for one season and then they're dead. So they are what is usually chosen for beautifying or decorating someplace. They're also the cheapest. So it's another thing to keep in mind. But But there is the possibility of sequestering annuals as another issue. And say maybe annuals are not what we're including here, maybe planters are not what we're including here. Maybe the idea that where we have things that are above ground and plants aren't actually planted in a garden bed are an exception.
I would also, however, suggest that if anybody goes up to O'Hara and looks at the demonstration gardens, up there, which are all native plants, and those are planted with a variety of different plants in those gardens that bloom at different times. And those gardens have different looks over the course of the season. They're not like a whole line of innovations, but I think they're very beautiful. And so there are strategies you can do that can be very effective. That has CJ and Peter all over them, monitoring them, and that may not be what we can do every place. So but it's a different aesthetic look that maybe people, and I think the demonstration gardens up there are gorgeous, and they're gorgeous all season, but they're a different look than planters maybe.
They generally need more area because you have to have successional planting. When something blooms, it dies, something else blooms, it dies. Whereas in a small planter, you try to plant something that's just going to bloom. So it is a challenge.
So you think, I guess my question to you would be then, because I do think you can get used to a different aesthetic, right? Like, I think you're used to seeing one thing all the time, and then, you're like, that's the only nice thing. And then you see something else and you're like, oh, that's pretty too, right? So is it feasible in those plants? I guess I would like to explore that as an option, right? To if we're going to do, I happen to think they're really beautiful, and I love those gardens. I think they're at the nature center. I think that's a really beautiful place, but it can be just an issue of getting people sort of used to a different look.
And it's also the constituencies that are involved. I mean, if the garden club or the beautification committee are involved, there may be a lot of unhappy soldiers who don't like the idea that they're not able to plant their petunias this year because they're not native. And I think we should be open and sensitive to that. I mean, I personally don't think we need to be stomping on a lot of toes here, because annuals, frankly, I mean, they die in 1 year, and unless they're self-seeding and invasive, there may not be a reason to include them. And I know Chet and I differ on this. So we don't have the same opinion here on this.
So let's say we have a different way of approaching the right solution. But here's something that we talked about, and just going to your question. I think there's some spots in the village where even like up to the area that's top of Main Street where the signs are, or that little thing where you might say, you know what, we're going to take that as a new challenge, and we're going to plant only natives in there and experiment and see what will work, and use that as a way of educating people and getting people to think, oh, that's a different look, but it'd be good. And I think the value of having a policy this way is it offers a real opportunity to engage people and to engage the community and be creative about it, just the way what's been going on at the O'Hara Nature Center that just got everybody excited about. And even what's going on in Madison, that garden around the playground, I think, or how many people have said to me, wow, that is really spectacular. And they may not think whether it's native or non-native, but it's a different feel that they now begin to see. So one of the goals of this is to not just be draconian, but to be as a vehicle to get people to see the things.
I mean, I'm smiling only because, again, I think that's what my husband was trying to do with that corner of our house, which has been a 4-year process. And really at the beginning, I was like, what the hell is that? Until it's like kind of growing in, but it's a process.
It is a different aesthetic.
It's a process.
And
Yeah.
for example, I go back to the New Guinean patients because they're so vibrant right now.
Mhm.
But that whole strip was planted with beautiful grasses. And sneezeweed, it doesn't make you sneeze. They made stuff from it in the old ages. That's why they call it sneezeweed, and black-eyed Susans and anise hyssop. If they were in there right now, it would be absolutely unbelievable gorgeous. But it'd be a different aesthetic. It would be sort of a little like a wild meadow, as opposed to a very tame, tidy row of red plants. So it's a different way of looking at it and thinking about it. So
lends to all the sustainable landscape that we're trying to do. I mean, this is part of the shift that we're hoping more people will adopt in general.
Probably an even bigger question is the lawns and athletic fields by the river. And again, it may become something that is so difficult to tackle that it shouldn't be part of this policy. But it is something for us to think about because the grasses that are being grown down there are not native. And I don't even know what the solutions are, if there are solutions.
Are there native playing surfaces? I know there's.
So one question is like for the athletic fields. I'm not a turf specialist, so I can't tell you whether there are native grasses that could survive playing ball on them. I don't know. And so I don't know the answer to that. And, one of the thoughts would be that's perhaps something that has to be studied. And again, this policy is not to tear things out, but to think about what's going forward. And maybe that is something that Joe may not have time, but maybe RPAC and can work with, Charlotte and stuff like that. Look at that. Because let me tell you something, there's a lot of people who know that stuff and turf specialists who can tell you that stuff. I'm just not.
And there are places where we can decide, is this policy about trees? Is it about trees and shrubs? Is it about trees, shrubs, and perennials? Is it about trees, shrubs, perennials, and annuals? Or is it about everything, including grasses? So I think that's to be decided, really.
Trees seem to be something, that's I'm not saying easy, but it seems like it's fairly straightforward. In a conversation, the recent conversation with CJ, he was talking about a native tree nursery that he wanted to sort of start up at the nature center where they'd be growing native trees.
So much demand and there's not enough inventory.
What's that?
There's so much demand and there's not enough supply.
It's very hard to locate native trees. Very hard.
But I imagine that would be years in the economy.
I'll be his first client.
Yeah.
I'm on Main Street.
Yeah.
So, I think there definitely should be a carve out for educational demonstration, interpretive processes. If CJ wants to teach apple grafting up at the nature center, he should be able to because they're not native, but it's a great program he's got going up there. So I think we need to make sure we're not tying anyone's hands in those terms. Also, if say someone who came along and wanted to plant an interpretive or demonstration garden in one of the parks and wanted to bring in different non-native plants for demonstration or educational purposes, I think it makes perfect sense as long as they're not invasive. So, and then we already talked about the beautification committee and the Main Street plantings and stuff. So that's the last point. So it's sort of a work in progress. We did cobble together something, but we thought it was better to let you guys see this in a more bulleted fashion, what we're thinking about. And we'd like to hear back from you, what your thoughts are.
Well, if you, in my mind, if you were coming here to get encouragement from us, I think you're going to get encouragement from us. I think you know a lot more than we know about what the limitations are. Halfway through this conversation, I was saying, well, why don't you just make everything native? Because what do I know? So I think we would encourage as a general policy that we move ahead with this. And with your sort of specific ideas and sort of let us know where the questions are, in which direction.
I think we should get some input from the people this affects though, like at the rec department of parks, because athletic fields, I know there's a lot of issues with safety, maintenance and upkeep, so the decisions that are made sometimes are really in those areas and cost. And I think it'd be hard maybe to just say, hey, because that throws another variable in there. That's the only thing that raised a little bit of a red flag for me.
Yeah, I think the athletic fields and the lawns in the parks down there will probably be the toughest sell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think too. And my guess is there probably are some kind of native that can do it, but it's probably like 8 times as much, because that's how it always works, right? Like
it has to be maintained more and
Yeah.
replaced more often, and And causes knee injuries and.
So, but
But maybe, and maybe not.
maybe not. I had a friend who was, he basically all he did was he went to professional fields, and especially ones that had turf, and then to play international soccer, you have to actually put natural grass down. So it's pretty interesting, like, so like the field, like the Meadowlands, it's really crappy turf, but when they play soccer, they actually bring in grass. So that's this whole thing. And I remember he said there's only like 4 types of grass they use on every single professional field in the world. So I'm guessing none of those are from the Hudson Valley.
This is the center of everything.
Yeah,
Well,
exactly.
Apparently, you're the expert now.
Yeah, I mean, I know some.
Your friend.
He's an expert, but he's not an expert on like lawns, it's playing fields, so it's like,
Well, I
Yeah.
do know we have an irrigation system down there for watering the athletic fields. And it was specifically designed, I think I remember when that was all developed, to minimize the runoff into the river so that all of that, whatever their fertilizer they're using, whatever they're putting on it, is hopefully staying in the fields. It's probably not, but steps were taken when that was built to try to mitigate that problem. But the lawns themselves, I mean, there are a lot of lawn area down
Yeah.
there. Does it really need to be non-native? And if it's non-native and we're pumping fertilizer and
Yeah.
water into it, to keep it looking bright green all the time, is that really what we should be doing? down there?
I think I would say that a lot of times, it just in my own experience, I think you have to question things, because I think we sort of assume, we have a lot of assumptions about like what has to be a certain way or how something was started one way. And like, then when you sort of look at it, there's really not a good reason, and maybe there is a good alternative. So I think it's really important to just kind of be open about it. And especially, again, just to pick on Jorge for like a minute, like the plants, I think it's something you gotta get used to, right? Like, I'm the worst gardener ever, and definitely somebody who's like, I just want it to look pretty,
Right.
then you live on all kinds of rock and you're like, oh, this can't grow anything. So
those are my
But
neighbors.
Yeah.
These nuggets are always changing. I mean,
They
you
are.
look at the
Yeah.
urn here, the big iron urn. It's got grasses in it this year.
Yeah.
Whoever did the planting this year, and all
Yeah.
of our street corners have grasses. You wouldn't have seen grasses 10, 15 years
Yeah.
ago in these planters. So
But
people's
also,
ideas
yeah,
of
and also,
grasses
I don't
have
think
are
people
changed.
know what they like or don't like until they see it. You know what I mean? I think it's easy to say like, I'm comfortable with like, colorful plants, which we can't have anywhere near, because of the deer. They'll eat it in 3 seconds. But like I've been living on Riverview Road now for like 12 years, I think 11, 12 years. And you get used to that different aesthetic because there is no growing flowers, right? Like it's like grasses and other plants and native, our one corner where we get sun, native plants. So I just think you have to also kind of like get used to a different look, right? If that's what you're, yeah.
You're talking about it's education.
Yeah,
I actually think the top of Main Street can be a great classroom, because I think we have the demonstration gardens in the nature center, but people who go to the nature center are more likely to like that already.
Yeah,
I think. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, but I think the top of Main Street can be a really great spot to
Good.
say, hey, we're doing some turnover, and then check out what we're doing. It's really exciting.
Yeah.
And even going back to lawns, I work at a national pollinator pathway thing. We work a lot with golf courses, which are a very challenging, a lot of lawn. And there's a very active effort in New York State and across the country to move to native plantings on golf courses. And there's a lot of limits about what you can do because of the need of both the greens, but the areas around it. And there's a lot of learning about it. That again, I don't have, but I think I know I can find people who can help us quickly understand what are the options. Are they viable? And I think what Rich said is absolutely right. You don't want to, the athletic fields have to be athletic fields. You have to be able to operate that way. And you don't want to have a lot of extra cost. But if there are alternatives to it that can be as cost effective and help move this process forward, I think we should.
I think to the point that they probably don't need as much water, they don't need as much fertilizer. At
That's
least
the big thing in the golf course, because that is they're saving money hand over fist when golf courses move to these more native plants. And even grass.
All you have to do is go to,
And interminable infants.
you go to Ireland and Scotland and see natural grasses on every course. Right?
Yeah.
It's hard to call.
Yeah.
It's a challenge.
Yes.
But I even see opportunity in places like Matheson in particular, where it, our park's been beautifully renovated and stuff, but yet we really didn't address native landscaping down there except in the playground. And I look at the perimeter where I know we have water runoff into the river all the time. And we're not addressing that. And I go to Terrytown and I see what they've done on their waterfront with all the native grasses planted right along the river. And I can tell just looking at it, I mean, you're not be an environmental scientist to get it. You just look at it and that is stopping the stormwater. And it's pulling out a lot of the pollutants that would be going into the river. And so I think it gives us an opportunity to start looking at these things and even thinking, maybe some point in the future, we want to think about replanting that entire perimeter so that we're actually protecting the river from what's in the park.
I mean, that seems like a good idea.
It is.
And that's not by the way, that's not
Doesn't
the
seem
athletic.
hard.
field.
Seems
There's
like a good idea.
there's a strip of grass by the river, and then you cross the path to get to the athletic.
Right,
field.
no, I'm not talking about that.
Yeah, no, I'm saying
Yeah.
that I have a concern about the athletic field, but I think this wouldn't even,
No,
And I think the interesting thing about Matheson is you can almost do some trials, like
Yeah.
only on the north end, and then like you could slowly shut.
well, it's even occurred to me, I know people that concerned about views from the park. They don't have to be tall, but you could even have pauses in it where there can be a bench so that you can go and sit and look out the river. And then have another 100 feet of native plantings and then have another bench or something, but all of that would mitigate the stormwater runoff and would help the river tremendously, so. But that's not this policy. So,
Well,
they
we're
could-
stating the village policy, and
Right.
it's part of the process.
I mean, I do think that if this policy is done with like a goal of education and kind of desired compliance rather than a, kind of draconian, you can't plant this because we're smarter than you. I don't think anyone will be against it.
But how do you get there? I mean, we
Who
did,
says that?
we did talk,
Oh, I hear it all.
we did
Um,
talk about those differences. and
yeah.
Do we need another man?
I even think things like, I think having a policy where the village would be trying to do this 100% as the role model, like it seems like the other communities have. I think when they come for the replantings, what I'd like to see is, okay, if you do our native replantings, there's no fee, there's no, like, whatever costs we can reduce, we can get you a discount at this nursery, whatever, like, if there's homeowners now, yeah.
Oh,
So for like the replanting agreement, if you go all native, we want you to go all native. Here's what we recommend. If you do that, there's no fees. I don't know if there's any fees now for this. So it's up
Like,
to.
we're gonna go from 0 to 0 for you.
Right, but if we can say, we have a,
Tax credit.
we know a place where you can, work on this, we negotiated a deal. Or something, like, I feel there's a way that you can incentivize it, so I think I always used to say like things about like the historic district. If you showed people, this is the right historic window. 9 times out of 10, they're gonna go, great, that's what I want. I didn't know that when I first put my plans in.
Would $10 do it? Because they pay a $10 fee for their permit.
There you go.
So you replant a native tree, you show me the proof, you're
You get
$10.
$10 back. So maybe we have to raise the permit fee for everybody. To
$5,000.
but there must be like, there must be some mechanism we can do to make it easier on if they do the right thing.
But are you saying that you think a native plant policy should be more inspiration, the village trying to inspire people to do things rather than mandating?
In some ways, like cause I just think most people don't think about it. And if they have a landscaper that does, I think often, like I've talked to a couple of local landscapers, and they say that when they go with the local, the natives, usually people don't even know one way or the other. It's because it's very rare. I think sometimes like we fall back on we want the geraniums because that's what my grandmother, my mother planted, so I want those too. But I think if someone comes in and says, I have a great plan, here it is, and it's all native, that's fantastic. I feel like a lot of it is just education. So I don't know if we need I think we should, invasives obviously should be prohibited. But beyond that, I feel like
But are we,
No, I-
we're talking about landowners or village?
I think invasives for everybody.
Okay.
So can I
Sure.
color this? I I recognize that homeowners, what people do in their own yards, they do in their own yards, whatever, you can encourage them, you can educate them, whatever. I do think the village is in a position on its own property to set an example.
I agree with that as well.
And setting an example. And it's engaging the departments and then encouraging them as well. And I think that, you know, whether it's a mandate or whatever, I think it's more than just kind of, you know, we have different views about how aspirational this should be and how informative it should be and whatever, and ways of doing that. But I do think, and I look at what's happened at O'Hara and how that has taken, and I give Joe Archino tremendous credit and growing awareness of what the value of all that stuff is. You haven't been exposed to it, and more people go up there. And I think there's a real opportunity here for the village to lead, as other villages around us and the state has done, the state park system have done, to lead by example. And I would encourage us to do that.
I think for the village, I agree 100%.
Yeah,
I think that's a policy we can all, you know, endorse and embrace and, you know, celebrate.
So what you were saying applies to
Homeowners,
Okay.
homeowners only. I think, you know, for me, that's not the strong policy for the village. It's great. You know, I'd ask if we get the school to volunteer to do it with us as well, because people never know the difference between us and the school. I hear it all the
What
time.
percentage of the land in Irvington is schools?
I don't know.
More than
Well,
the
you know,
village.
to that point,
They have more land than we do,
Do they?
I
To
believe
that
so.
point, Brian, I have been working with the high school, because the high school redid their area up front in Charleston as well.
Yeah.
And the high school students have just planted a new native kind of meadow in the swell just to the west of the high school. And as an educational thing, and the school is actually, whether how it plays out or not, but the school has embraced this as well. And so there's an opportunity to work. You know, again, you don't want to tear up everything that's all there, but you want to look at ways of connecting this in with the school. And I think you'll find them receptive.
Well, thanks for all this work. It's interesting.
Thank you so
Look forward to
much.
hearing more.
And for the education. For those of us that don't.
Yeah.
live there, that's not-
Literally, you got to get out.
I like looking at it through glass. I love sitting,
I
These are
always
delicate
look at it
flowers.
through glass.
I love looking out my living room window and watching everything go by and stuff, but
From the couch.
no, from the table I'm working, I like looking out, you know.
You know, I'm almost never inside, except when I sleep.
Mm. I had friends go camping and they sent me pictures and I sent them a picture of my air conditioner and my roof and my ceiling fan.
I'll make a motion to adjourn. Anyone who wants to go outside can. Anyone wants to stay inside, Mitch, you can.
Thank you.
Second.
All in favor. Thanks those for joining us on TV. Mary Ann.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks. Yeah, see ya. Good night.
Right.